Imagine picking up your next smartphone only to find its price skyrocketing, not because of a tech glitch, but due to a reawakened trade war. Today, we explore how Trump's decisive win is not only shaking up global tech, but also straining long-standing trade partnerships, even with Canada. Trump's return to power means one thing for certain: tariffs are back. From semiconductors to AI chips, from steel to aluminum, the protectionist playbook is open once again. But what does that mean for you, for tech, and for America's allies? In this deep dive, we unravel how these policies are reshaping global trade, igniting a tech war, and even putting a historic friendship with Canada to the test. Trump's win and policy shift. Trump has already won it, and with his second term, expect a resurgence of bold protectionist measures. Tariffs that not only target China, but also impact allies. Today, we're diving into what this means for the tech sector and global trade. Over the course of his first term, Trump made tariffs a centerpiece of his economic policy. In 2018, he imposed sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum imports under the guise of national security. This move sent shockwaves through global markets, angering allies like Canada, the European Union, and Japan. The administration's trade war with China escalated as tariffs expanded to cover nearly $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, from electronics to agricultural products. While these policies aim to bring back American manufacturing jobs, they also led to increased consumer prices and retaliatory tariffs that hit U.S. farmers and exporters hard. Now, with a second term secured, Trump is doubling down on this strategy. Unlike the first wave of tariffs that primarily targeted China, his new policy broadens the focus to include traditional allies. Canada, a long-standing trade partner, has become one of the latest casualties. With new tariffs on aluminum and steel, Trump argues that even allies have taken advantage of American industry for too long. His administration believes that tariffs are necessary to level the playing field and boost domestic production, reinforcing his "Make America Great Again" economic philosophy. However, businesses and policymakers fear this will further strain diplomatic ties and disrupt supply chains that have long been interwoven between the U.S. and its partners. Tariffs and trade. The new tariff structure focuses heavily on semiconductors and critical tech components, a move meant to counter China's growing dominance in the chip industry. The Biden administration previously attempted to control China's access to cutting-edge chips through export restrictions, but Trump's strategy takes a different approach, placing tariffs on Chinese-made chips and offering incentives for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. However, many industry experts warn that these tariffs could inadvertently raise prices for U.S. companies reliant on foreign-made components. Another major point of contention is the reintroduction of tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel. Canada, which supplies a significant portion of the U.S.'s raw materials for auto and tech manufacturing, has already signaled its intent to retaliate. This could result in price hikes across multiple industries, including car manufacturing and infrastructure development. The tariffs threaten to undo years of trade cooperation under the USMCA, formerly NAFTA, raising concerns about economic uncertainty for businesses operating across North America. AI deregulation and cybersecurity : While tariffs create tension abroad, Trump's administration is also planning deregulation in the AI sector to bolster American innovation. The goal is to remove bureaucratic hurdles for tech companies working on artificial intelligence, making it easier to develop and deploy AI-driven solutions. Trump's team argues that reducing regulatory burdens will accelerate advancements in autonomous technology, machine learning, and cybersecurity. However, critics caution that a lack of oversight could lead to ethical dilemmas, potential data privacy issues, and unchecked corporate influence over AI development. Cybersecurity is another priority. with Trump advocating for increased federal investment in securing critical infrastructure against cyber threats. The administration is likely to impose stricter security requirements on foreign tech companies operating in the US, particularly those with ties to China. This could lead to new restrictions on companies like TikTok, Huawei, and DJI, further complicating international trade relations. Cryptocurrency regulation. In the financial sector, Trump is taking a pro-business stance on cryptocurrency, aiming to mainstream digital assets while implementing oversight to prevent fraud and illicit activities. His administration is expected to appoint key figures with ties to the crypto industry to oversee regulatory policy, signaling a shift towards integrating blockchain technology into mainstream finance. While this may encourage institutional investment in digital assets, skeptics worry that heavy-handed regulations could stifle innovation and drive startups overseas. Coming up, we'll break down how these tariffs ignite a tech war, impacting companies like Apple, Tesla, and NVIDIA, examine the ripple effects on everyday consumers, and explore how even Canada isn't spared from these drastic measures. The economic landscape is shifting rapidly, and businesses across multiple sectors are preparing for the consequences. With tariffs on critical tech components, the cost of producing consumer electronics is set to rise, affecting everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. Major companies like Apple and Tesla must now decide whether to pass these costs on to consumers or find alternative supply chain solutions. Meanwhile, semiconductor companies face an uphill battle as tariffs disrupt access to essential manufacturing materials. Beyond the tech industry, Trump's protectionist policies are fueling tensions with America's closest allies. The dispute with Canada is emblematic of a larger shift. Long-standing partnerships are being tested, and the global economy is adapting to a new era of economic nationalism. As the documentary progresses, we will explore the unfolding trade war, its winners and losers, and what it all means for the future of innovation, business, and international relations. The impact of tariffs on tech. Tariffs create ripple effects across supply chains. In the tech world, these measures force companies to pay more for imported components, which eventually impacts the end user. The technology industry operates on a global scale, with raw materials, semiconductors, and assembly processes spread across multiple countries. Trump's renewed tariff strategy means higher costs for critical tech components, and that burden ultimately falls on both businesses and consumers. How rising costs affect smartphones, laptops, and EVs. The introduction of new tariffs on semiconductors, lithium-ion batteries, and critical minerals is already leading to price hikes for essential consumer products. Smartphone manufacturers like Apple and Samsung are now weighing their options, whether to absorb the increased costs or pass them on to customers through higher prices. A new iPhone could now cost $100 to $200 more just because of tariff-related supply chain disruptions, says an industry analyst. Consumers will see these effects not just in flagship devices, but across all price ranges. Laptops and gaming consoles are similarly affected, with supply chain shortages leading to delays and higher costs. In the electric vehicle, EV industry, manufacturers like Tesla, Ford, and Rivian are facing rising production costs due to increased tariffs on battery components sourced from China and other nations. Tesla, which has aggressively expanded its global production network, may have to shift battery manufacturing to US soil, a move that could delay new models and inflate prices. Apple's potential supply chain shift away from China. Apple, one of the most significant players in global tech, has already begun diversifying its manufacturing base, expanding production into countries like India and Vietnam. With additional tariffs looming, Apple is now facing tough decisions. The problem isn't just moving manufacturing out of China, it's that China has built a sophisticated supply chain that's nearly impossible to replicate overnight, says a supply chain expert. Even if Apple moves some assembly to India, it still relies heavily on China for components like chips and displays. While Apple won't completely abandon China, experts predict a slow but steady relocation of certain production lines to minimize the impact of tariffs. Semiconductor shortages and their impact on NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. Semiconductors are the backbone of modern technology. From AI development to gaming consoles, these tiny chips power everything, and the new tariffs are exacerbating an already fragile supply chain. The semiconductor industry has been struggling with supply shortages since 2020, says a market analyst. Trump's tariffs on imported chips will add yet another layer of complexity and cost to the equation. NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel, three major players in the semiconductor space, are preparing for turbulent times. NVIDIA, which relies on Taiwan's TSMC for chip fabrication, may need to accelerate plans for alternative manufacturing hubs. AMD, competing directly with Intel in the CPU and GPU markets, could also see costs rise due to restricted access to Chinese suppliers. Intel, which has pledged to increase domestic chip production, might benefit in the long run, but in the short term, it faces higher operational costs and potential delays in production. If semiconductor costs surge, expect PCs, gaming consoles, and AI hardware to become significantly more expensive for businesses and consumers alike. The AI and innovation angle. While tariffs raise costs, the Trump administration is also pushing for deregulation to propel the US to the front of the global AI race. But can innovation truly flourish under the weight of higher production costs? Artificial intelligence is at the center of geopolitical competition, with both the US and China vying for technological dominance. Trump's administration has made it clear, America must lead in AI at all costs. To accomplish this, the White House is taking an aggressive pro-business approach to deregulation, aiming to accelerate AI development by reducing bureaucratic hurdles for tech companies. US versus China AI race. Who's really winning? China's state-backed AI initiatives have fueled rapid advancements in machine learning, facial recognition, and automation. Meanwhile, US firms like OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and Microsoft have pioneered cutting-edge breakthroughs in natural language processing and generative AI. However, Trump's tariffs on China could also backfire, making it harder for US tech companies to access key AI hardware components sourced from Chinese firms. This could slow down innovation rather than speed it up. The irony is that while the US government is pushing for AI leadership, the tariffs may actually make AI development more expensive, notes a Silicon Valley investor. Impact on AI startups and investment shifts. For AI startups, these policies present a double-edged sword. On one hand, deregulation could make it easier for startups to develop AI technologies without excessive government red tape. On the other hand, tariffs could increase operational costs, making it harder for small firms to compete with industry giants like Google and Amazon. The venture capital world is also taking notice. Many investors are now looking toward European and Southeast Asian AI firms as alternative investment opportunities. Cybersecurity and crypto. In tandem with tariffs and AI, cybersecurity measures are ramping up, and a new approach to cryptocurrency regulation is emerging, transforming how digital assets integrate into our financial systems. The government's new stance on crypto and its potential regulation. Trump's administration is redefining America's crypto policy. While previous administrations took a more cautious approach, the new White House strategy aims to integrate cryptocurrency into the mainstream financial system while imposing stricter oversight. The days of Wild West crypto markets are numbered, says a financial analyst. The government wants regulation that protects investors while still encouraging innovation. Key changes include stronger oversight of crypto exchanges to prevent fraud and illicit transactions, encouragement of stablecoins and CBDCs central bank digital currencies as alternatives to volatile cryptocurrencies, institutional investment incentives to integrate blockchain into traditional banking. This approach may increase legitimacy for crypto markets, but some fear excessive regulation could push blockchain innovation offshore, as seen in China's crackdown on Bitcoin mining. Cybersecurity measures to protect critical tech infrastructure. Cyber threats remain one of the biggest challenges in the digital age. With Trump's administration prioritizing national security, new regulations are being introduced to fortify America's digital infrastructure. From ransomware attacks to espionage, cybersecurity is no longer optional. It's a necessity, states a cybersecurity expert. Key initiatives include mandatory security audits for tech firms handling critical data, increased restrictions on foreign tech companies like TikTok, Huawei, and ZTE, a push for domestic cybersecurity solutions to reduce dependence on foreign software. These measures aim to protect sensitive government and corporate data, but they also risk inflaming tensions with China, Russia, and other nations heavily invested in the tech space. The battle lines in the tech war are being drawn. On one side, tariffs and protectionist policies aim to boost American manufacturing and security. On the other, these same policies may increase costs, disrupt supply chains, and limit global collaboration. As we move forward, we'll explore the wider economic impact of Trump's policies, including how they affect major U.S. businesses and their relationships with key allies like Canada. Effects on major tech companies. Narration. Major tech players like Apple, Tesla, and NVIDIA now face an uphill battle, not just with increased costs, but with a radical shift in the global supply chain. As Trump's tariffs continue reshaping international trade, some of the biggest names in tech are scrambling to adapt their sourcing and manufacturing strategies. Companies that once relied on cheap foreign production are now being forced to rethink their supply chains, relocate manufacturing, or absorb rising costs. How tariffs force companies to reconsider sourcing and manufacturing strategies. Apple, for example, has spent years integrating Chinese suppliers into its supply chain, from display panels to semiconductor chips. The new round of tariffs on Chinese imports is now forcing Apple to accelerate its shift away from China, exploring alternative manufacturing hubs in Vietnam, India, and Mexico. However, moving production is neither quick nor cheap, and some industry experts argue that Apple may have to pass the cost on to consumers in the form of higher-priced iPhones and MacBooks. A key challenge for companies like Apple and Tesla is that they are deeply embedded in global supply networks, explains a tech industry analyst. Reconfiguring those networks takes time and money, and tariffs are pushing them into difficult decisions. Tesla faces a similar dilemma. With tariffs on critical raw materials such as lithium, aluminum, and rare earth metals, the EV giant is exploring domestic mining partnerships to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers. While this move aligns with Trump's America First agenda, it also creates delays and adds costs to Tesla's ambitious production targets. Meanwhile, NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel, already struggling with semiconductor shortages, are now bracing for increased tariffs on imported chips. For companies reliant on TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and South Korean suppliers, any disruptions in the chip supply chain could slow innovation and drive up prices for GPUs, CPUs, and AI hardware. Potential winners and losers in the tariff war. While many companies are struggling, some US-based manufacturers are benefiting. Firms specializing in domestic chip production, battery manufacturing, and steel production are seeing a surge in demand as companies look for local alternatives to avoid tariffs. Potential winners: US steel and aluminum companies that now face less foreign competition. Domestic chip makers like Intel, which is expanding fabrication plants in Arizona and Ohio. Battery manufacturers in North America as EV makers shift sourcing away from China. Potential losers: multinational tech giants like Apple, Tesla, and NVIDIA that rely on global supply chains. Retailers and consumers, who will ultimately bear the increased cost of electronic goods and automobiles. Foreign suppliers, including Canadian aluminum and steel producers, that now face tariffs and supply chain uncertainty. Real-world examples and M&A activity. Recent global mergers and acquisitions, such as BlackRock's multi-billion-dollar port deal, demonstrate that Trump's policies are reshaping business strategies worldwide. As global trade tensions rise, companies are restructuring through mergers and acquisitions, M&A, to protect their supply chains and expand into new markets. One major example is BlackRock's multi-billion-dollar investment in international port infrastructure. By securing critical supply chain assets across Asia and Europe, BlackRock aims to minimize risks posed by Trump's trade policies and potential global shipping bottlenecks. Another notable shift is in the semiconductor industry, where companies are merging to consolidate resources. The recent NVIDIA ARM acquisition attempt, though ultimately blocked by regulators, was a sign of how tech giants are seeking control over chip production to insulate themselves from geopolitical instability. With supply chain disruptions becoming the norm, companies are making strategic acquisitions to secure long-term access to raw materials and production facilities, explains an M&A strategist. Additionally, automakers and battery suppliers are entering into joint ventures to reduce dependency on China. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla are actively partnering with North American lithium and rare earth mineral producers, ensuring they have access to the key materials needed for EV battery production. The Canada problem. Even traditional allies aren't immune. Canada, long a reliable trade partner, is now caught in the crosshairs of Trump's tariff strategy, facing tariffs on aluminum and steel that ripple through its economy. For decades, the US and Canada have enjoyed one of the world's strongest trade relationships. However, Trump's protectionist policies are threatening this historic partnership. How Canada's export industry is hit by tariffs. Canada is the largest supplier of aluminum and steel to the US, and the reimposed tariffs have sent shockwaves through Canadian industries. The added cost of exporting to the US means higher prices for raw materials, forcing Canadian manufacturers to either absorb the cost or pass it on to buyers. For Canadian steel and aluminum producers, Trump's tariffs are a direct hit, says a Canadian trade expert. We've built an integrated supply chain over decades, and these tariffs are a major disruption. One of the biggest concerns is the impact on Canadian auto manufacturers, who supply parts to US automakers. The added tariffs increase costs for US companies, which could lead to job losses and production cuts in Canada's auto sector. Retaliatory measures from Canada and the economic fallout. In response to Trump's tariffs, Canada has implemented a retaliatory tariffs on key US exports, targeting politically sensitive industries. Canada's countermeasures include tariffs on US steel and aluminum products, increased tariffs on American agricultural products, including dairy, beef, and soybeans, targeted tariffs on consumer goods such as bourbon, ketchup, and household appliances, items produced in key Republican strongholds. Canada's retaliatory tariffs are a calculated move, explains a trade policy expert. By targeting industries in swing states, they're putting political pressure on Trump to reconsider his stance. Despite the tensions, Canada remains one of the U.S.'s largest trading partners, and businesses on both sides of the border are urging leaders to reach a resolution. At the end of the day, our economies are deeply interconnected, says a Canadian business executive. Trade wars hurt both sides. We need to find a way to move forward. The consequences of Trump's tariff strategy are far-reaching. While some American industries benefit from reduced foreign competition, others are grappling with rising costs, supply chain disruptions, and strained relationships with key allies like Canada. In the next act, we examine the global economic aftermath, including how international markets are adapting, the emergence of new trade alliances, and whether America's protectionist stance is sustainable in an increasingly interconnected world. Shifting global alliances. Trump's tariff policies aren't isolated. They're catalysts for a global reshuffle. As the U.S. fortifies its borders, other nations are forced to adapt. For decades, globalization has been the defining force of international trade. China positioned itself as the world's factory, producing everything from semiconductors to electric vehicles, while nations like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union played integral roles in the U.S. supply chain. But Trump's renewed tariffs have disrupted this dynamic, forcing countries and corporations to rethink their trade and manufacturing strategies. The rise of Vietnam and India as alternative manufacturing hubs. As tensions between the U.S. and China escalate, companies seek alternative production hubs to avoid tariffs and mitigate geopolitical risks. Two of the biggest beneficiaries, Vietnam and India. Companies that once relied on Chinese factories are now moving operations to Vietnam and India, explains a global trade analyst. These nations offer lower labor costs, growing industrial sectors, and, most importantly, fewer trade restrictions. Vietnam has rapidly emerged as a manufacturing powerhouse, particularly in electronics and textiles. Companies like Samsung and Apple have already begun shifting production to Vietnam, taking advantage of its business-friendly environment and proximity to China. Meanwhile, India is positioning itself as a major alternative to China, particularly in tech manufacturing and semiconductors. With government incentives for foreign investment, India has already attracted Apple, Google, and Tesla, all of whom are expanding production capabilities in the region. India's Make in India initiative is accelerating the country's manufacturing growth, says an economist. If tariffs on China persist, expect more companies to pivot toward India as a long-term solution. However, Vietnam and India face challenges in fully replacing China's dominance. China still possesses unmatched supply chain efficiency, infrastructure, and workforce specialization, factors that take decades to develop elsewhere. For many corporations, a full transition away from China remains impractical. The US-China tech divide. Is globalization breaking apart? Beyond manufacturing, Trump's tariffs are contributing to a technological Cold War between the US and China. The world is splitting into two tech ecosystems, one led by the US, the other by China. Tech is at the heart of the new economic battle, says a geopolitical analyst. It's no longer just about trade. It's about who controls the future of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and 5G networks. In response to US trade policies, China has accelerated efforts to reduce dependence on American technology. Huawei and SMIC, China's largest chipmaker, are developing domestic alternatives to Western semiconductor suppliers. China's AI industry is expanding with government-backed investments in deep learning and automation. The Chinese government is pushing for a self-reliant tech ecosystem, limiting the use of US software and hardware. Meanwhile, the US is restricting China's access to critical tech components. Export bans on AI chips, software, and semiconductors are designed to cripple China's ability to compete with American firms like NVIDIA and Intel. We're witnessing the fragmentation of global technology, says a Silicon Valley executive. Instead of one interconnected world, we're moving toward two rival tech economies, one centered around the US and its allies, and the other dominated by China. This shift has huge implications for the future of innovation. If the world splits into competing technological spheres, it could slow down global progress, increase costs for consumers, and make international cooperation on issues like cybersecurity and AI development far more difficult. New tech geography and supply chain realignment. As traditional trade relationships strain under protectionist policies, new manufacturing hubs are emerging. Will America reclaim tech dominance, or will the global center of gravity shift to Asia and beyond? The US government is pushing for domestic manufacturing growth, aiming to bring production back home. Through incentives such as the CHIPS Act and tax breaks for domestic factories, Washington hopes to reduce reliance on foreign supply chains and boost American industry. Rebuilding American manufacturing is a top priority, says a US trade official. We want to ensure that the next generation of technology, whether AI, semiconductors, or electric vehicles, is made in America. But can the US realistically reclaim its position as a global manufacturing powerhouse? Many experts remain skeptical. High labor costs in the US make domestic production far more expensive than in Asia. Manufacturing infrastructure in China, Vietnam, and India is years ahead of what the US can currently offer. Skilled labor shortages could delay efforts to scale up production in America. Meanwhile, countries in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Latin America are benefiting from the realignment of global trade. As companies diversify their supply chains, new regional tech hubs are emerging, particularly in countries like Mexico, Indonesia, and Poland. The global supply chain isn't disappearing, it's just shifting, explains a trade economist. We're seeing the emergence of multiple tech hubs instead of one dominant player. For American businesses, the challenge lies in navigating this complex new trade landscape. Some companies may embrace domestic production, while others will continue leveraging global supply chains, finding creative ways to minimize tariff impacts. The central question remains, can the US successfully reclaim tech dominance, or will the global center of gravity permanently shift to Asia and beyond? In the final act, we'll explore the long-term implications of Trump's policies, examining future trade scenarios and whether protectionism is truly sustainable in the modern global economy. The big question, what's next? At the crossroads of innovation and protectionism lies a pivotal question: what's next for global tech and trade? The world is standing on the edge of a trade and technology revolution. The decisions made today by governments, corporations, and consumers will determine the future of global trade, innovation, and economic power. While some view Trump's tariffs as a necessary tool for protecting American industry, others warn that they could permanently damage international alliances and drive up costs for everyone. The long-term effects of tariffs on consumer prices and innovation. With tariffs on semiconductors, electronics, steel, and AI components, the cost of consumer goods is likely to keep rising. From smartphones to electric vehicles, companies that rely on international supply chains will pass the costs on to consumers. Some analysts estimate that continued trade restrictions could lead to a 10 to 20% increase in prices for major electronics and consumer goods. The tariffs don't just impact factories and corporations, explains an economic analyst. They affect every single consumer, whether it's through more expensive laptops, higher grocery bills, or rising energy costs. For the technology sector, tariffs could stifle innovation. When companies spend more on sourcing raw materials and navigating trade barriers, they have less capital for research and development. This could slow the progress of AI, 5G, quantum computing, and green energy solutions. However, others argue that these trade restrictions force innovation in a different way. With higher costs and limited access to certain materials, companies may be compelled to develop alternative technologies and build more resilient domestic industries. We've seen this pattern before, notes a historian. Whenever global trade shifts, new solutions emerge. The challenge is whether the U.S. can innovate faster than the economic pressures that tariffs create. Possible policy shifts under a new administration. As elections loom, the future of trade policy remains uncertain. If Trump continues his aggressive protectionist stance, expect further tariffs, increased restrictions on foreign tech firms, and a continued push for U.S.-based manufacturing. If a new administration takes over, however, trade policies could shift dramatically. Possible scenarios include a rollback of tariffs on allied nations like Canada and Europe to restore diplomatic ties, a renegotiation of trade agreements with China, potentially easing restrictions while maintaining competitive advantages for U.S. businesses, increased global cooperation on tech and cybersecurity, particularly in AI regulation and data privacy. A renewed focus on supply chain resilience, with incentives for domestic production alongside strategic international partnerships. If history tells us anything, it's that economic policies are rarely permanent, says a policy expert. Governments adapt to changing global conditions, and businesses will continue to find ways to thrive, regardless of who is in power. Trump's tariff policies are reshaping not just our economy, but the very fabric of global technology and trade. With allies like Canada feeling the strain and rivals like China pushing ahead in innovation, the future is more uncertain than ever. The tech war, trade realignment, and geopolitical shifts we've explored in this documentary paint a picture of a world in transition. Some industries will adapt and thrive, while others will struggle with rising costs and supply chain disruptions. For consumers, businesses, and policymakers, the next few years will be crucial in determining whether tariffs strengthen or weaken the U.S. economy. The ultimate question isn't just about tariffs, it's about what kind of future we want. The narrator concludes, do we embrace globalization or do we turn inward? Do we compete through protectionism or through innovation? As the global economy enters a new era, only time will tell whether these trade battles will lead to long-term prosperity or unintended consequences. If you liked this, you will love our other video on Trump, which you can watch right now. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe Rumiat for more insights.